friends, this is Rick, and we are talking about Gondor and why it succeeded where Arnor did not. And I realized when I was in the doing the first version of this that like always, I'm haphazard. I am not a professional at this by any means. That there are so many other people out there producing some awesome, great YouTube videos on the very same topics or material that I'm attempting to do. And the difference, though, in my humble opinion, is our viewpoints and how we perceive what we've read and what we've studied. It from the passing lay person, for example, they just know what they saw in Jackson's movies, or maybe they saw some comic book version, or they read the novels. But for those of us who have lived and ate and breathed Tolkien's world since we were very young, we have a much deeper thirst for this subject material and opinions. So my opinions may vary. They may echo other people's material, but they also may vary. Another thing I noticed that when I was in the process of doing the first video is that the sheer amount of historical material necessary to really do a good job, it means that there's a lot more to talk about. That I probably need to do 3 sections instead of just one, because it just wasn't possible. And in part, again, that's because of my rambling halfway take at doing stuff. But keep in mind that I do this stuff from the heart and not from any other means or reasons. I don't care. I'm not going to ever make any money off of YouTube. That's just not going to happen. But I do love this material, this stuff, these topics, these subjects. And it's of interest to me, and it's an opportunity to share my viewpoint from a different perspective, from my own mind. So it is. It also is good and healthy for me to have these conversations, even if it just seems one-sided a little bit. So I welcome any kind of commentary that you people put out there, any suggestions, things like this. By all means, it is what it is. So, getting on to the Gondor. Gondor thrives and hits its peak during the Ship Kings, or at least this is that everybody feels, based on the total expansion. And the map in front of us gives us a slight view of that expansion. And I don't think it's totally accurate, because there's a lot of backwater territory on the southern side of the White Mountains on this map that appear to not be shaded in, and those areas are also under the influence of Gondor. Whether directly ruled or indirectly ruled, they're still part and parcel of Gondor. But for the lion's share, you can see the territory expansion the Ship Kings are able to achieve to the south. Now, we don't see is to the north. We see on parts of Anárion that are not shaded, which is ridiculous, because Anárian's always been territory of Gondor, even in its worst situation. It's only temporarily lost, but it's always reconquered. And Cardolan, I can't pronounce it, but the great sweeping areas to the north of the White Mountains that eventually become Rohan, well, those are also territories and should be shaded on this map, in my humble opinion. The inland influence and control of Gondor at its height reaches the Sea of Run, which is where the land of the Dorwinen, and far into the northern plains surrounding Long Lake and the eastern sides of Mirkwood. Excuse me there for a minute, because that's my morning libation to help loosen up the scraggly vocal cords that are still plaguing me from getting up this morning. So, we come up against the middle stretch of Gondor's success, and the first thing that occurs that's really devastating is the kin-strife. And the kin-strife serves a couple roles, and is well, in and of itself, it deserves its own video. And lots of people have done that, so I'm going to, kind of glaze over some things. We know that King Eldakar, his father had married a northern, let's call her a princess, because I don't believe he would have just gone for some northern northern average gal. It would have been, to my knowledge, and I think it is, that this was the daughter of a northern, the equivalent of a northern chieftain or what have you. But somebody, because his father spent quite a bit of time in the north and fighting the various tribes that are coming. They're being pushed in through into Rovinium through around the Sea of Rhun, and it's during this time he either cements an alliance or just falls for this young woman and marries her. Their child is Elhokar, and Elhokar has a distinct, huge problem. Even though, and I've mentioned this before in the Arnor series, even though the high men of Gondor, the Númenóreans of Gondor, the Gondorian Númenóreans, however you want to look at it, these Dunedain are still very strongly entrenched in the idea of purity of blood, of maintaining that ancient heritage. They have an average lifespan that's 2 to 3 times longer than that of lesser men. And there's the stature and nobility. There's something distinctive that sets them apart. And maybe not to the extent that the Anárion Dunedain pursued to their demise. The Gondorian Dunedain are still deeply entrenched in their bloodlines from Númenor, and they do not. While they might turn a blind eye to fellow Dunedain marrying into lesser Dunedain families or into middle men families bloodlines and further diluting the Númenórean bloodlines that exist, they are absolutely appalled by the idea that their royal Númenórean bloodline would ever even think of diluting itself by marrying into a lesser human genetic or genome, which is racist by our day's standards, but by their standards back then, there's a deep sense of self-preservation of their Númenórean heritage, as well as the understanding that most of these high men, these Dunedain, Gondorian Dunedain, they truly understand just how much they lose over time the further their bloodlines descend from the direct ancestry of Númenor. The less lifelines, their lifespans shrink, their health issues grow, etc. They diminish, become just men, and they fight against it. They rebel against it. So the idea that their king, Elhokar's father, would dare sire a half Northman son is just abhorrent to many of these people. Even the most loyal and stalwart members of the Gondorian Dunedain or Númenóreans would still have issues with it. Some to great extent, enough so that they rebelled against the concept of having a half Northman king. So Castamere, as it's suggested, egged on by his direct supporters and other people with other nefarious reasons. Because let's be honest, like any situation, when there's power to be grabbed, people try to grab power, and if they themselves can't sit in the seat or on the throne, but they can get access to those who do and influence them and thus increase their own power base, are going to do so, and they're going to do so with a vengeance. So these people support Castamere, if nothing else, but they push him into taking over, and he takes seizes control of the throne, forcing Elhokar to flee to the north. So this begins the kin-strife, which is a period of some years where this conflict arises, this civil war. And while in the end, Elhokar succeeds in gaining his throne and grudging acceptance of the majority of Gondor's ruling elite or elite bloodlines, its greatest loss is going to be those very pure-blooded high-men bloodlines. This civil war is brutal and vicious. Numerous conflicts, small and large, occur. before Eldacar reclaims his throne. And while the numbers are never said, we can only speculate. But I would think thousands of men die. And a lot of the people who are going to do this conflict, the middlemen, the lesser men, are probably going to sit by and shake their heads or secretly chortle as these so-called snobbish upper class go at each other and their minions. So this is a very major hit for Gondor's ruling elite, for the Hyman bloodlines, for the knowledge, and because we make this attachment. I guess I'm going from the sidebar on this. We make this attachment that the level of technology and civilization in Gondor is directly tied to the success or failure of these Númenórean descendants, the Gondorian Dunedain. And I keep referring to them in a different presence than Gondorians, and that's the whole for a reason. Once again, we can't know the exact numbers. We can only speculate that probably 30, maybe 20% of Gondor's population are of Númenórean descent, are Dunedain, in the argument that they are the Gondorian pure-blooded, what have you. And then there's another 15 or 20% that are with lesser Dunedain. So all total, probably a third of the population is directly or indirectly Númenórean. The rest are not, and they're never going to be. They're always going to be middlemen or lesser men in the eyes of those up above them. Now, this is typical of this mindset. This part of this, I don't want to call it a curse, but this legacy of Númenor that's passed along its descendants thousands of years after its failure, after it falls. And same thing goes on. So these high men war against each other over principle, over this ironic worry of the diminishment of the bloodline by allowing the king to sire a half Northman, half Dunedain heir. And in the process, thousands, in my mind, thousands of Gondorian Númenóreans die in this kin-strife. It's the term kin-strife. It's pretty devastating. It has to be a large number of these people. By no means a detrimental part. We don't see the same effect that this sort of thing would have in Arnor. In Arnor, the diminishment of the Arnorian Dunedain is gradual, but still no less problematic. In the end of the day, they're not willing to expand their bloodlines by adding fresh blood, because they don't want to diminish their connections to their ancestors, to Númenóreans. And this is a failed mindset. So, the kin-strife takes place. Lots of pure-blood Númenórean Gondorians are killed and die. Now, this is a bad thing. So how is this success? How does this add success to Gondor's survival over the long run? Well, the downside is the core of these diehard anti-king, whatever you want to call them, flee to Umbar and other places further south and set up the future conflicts. The Corsairs of Umbar and part are fueled on by these who become black Númenóreans by definition. The upswing to this is with Eldacar's successful defense of his throne and retaking of his seat over Gondor. This lessens or the end or the death of many of these purists, and the fleeing of some of the others, incorporates this mindset that men are men, and the men of the West are always going to be better than the men of the East. And we're back to the racial thing, but from a perspective of positivity, we see a upswing in that Gondor becomes more accepting of its middlemen as a whole and embrace them as Gondorians, as opposed to in Arnor, where the high men continued to look down their noses at anybody who were lesser than them, even their allies. So they just don't have the population base in Arnor, and they didn't have any opportunity to build upon it, what they did have, and they were purposely secluding themselves from making a viable population. We don't have this in Gondor. Gondor's population is vastly superior. Always has been, and we established that in part 1, where the Numerians, the faithful fleeing from the fallen Numer, come to Gondor because Gondor is already a bastion of Numerians. They're already here. Pelegra's a major city, etc., etc., etc. Lots of stuff going on. So the upswing is that Gondorians become more Gondorian after the kin-strife than prior to the kin-strife. So this leads us on to the next great catastrophe, the plague. In and around 1635, and lasting roughly for a couple of years, comes this plague out of the east. Not unlike some of the plagues from the Middle Ages that we know of our own history books. The sheer number of people who are decimated by this plague is just boggling. So, creeping out of the east comes this plague that decimates portions of Herod and Rune, the great. Let's take that into account. This plague starts in the east. We downplay this. They don't speak about this in the movies and in the books, and they downplay the sheer severity of it. So, Herod, Greater Herod, these large city nations or nations of humans in the east that's closest to the west or closest to Gondor are decimated by this same plague. Probably millions of human beings, humans, men and women, and their children die. And this goes from the south straight through the north. This impacts the areas around the Sea of Run, the Rowan, so on and so forth. A lot of these tribes that are up there are wiped completely out. And it's because, or diminished to the point where they're ineffective, which opens the door later for other eastern tribes of men, or eastern civilizations of men, to push westward into that gap, into that hole. The Northmen are decimated. The men in the Anduin Valley, in the eastern Mirkwood, in around Long Lake, are decimated as well. And so are the ancestors of the Rohirrim and men to the west. In Gondor proper, the plague even reaches as far west as Arnor, or what's left of it, but not to the degree that it hits Gondor. And we can add to the fact Gondor is a temperate location. We talked about that in the first video, that this is a Mediterranean temperate region, and that warm weather is going to be more. It's always said that things like plagues have a tendency to do better in hotter, warmer climates. I can't make the argument or not, because it seemed like most of the Middle Ages of Europe that had the various plagues had plenty of cold weather, and it did nothing to help them. In this case, the plague hits Gondor with a pile driver, and we're already less than 100 years from the kin-strife, and we get hit by the plague. And it's implied in the source material that I've read off and on that as much as 25% of the population is decimated. And in Gondor, the plague is worse, pretty much finishing off Osgiliath as a city. The city itself is already ruined from the kin-strife, and the population is further decimated by the plague. Probably half the population or more in and around Osgiliath is killed. This diminishes Gondor's ability to mass armies and maintain its frontier to the level that it did prior to this. It forces them to withdraw forces and the supporting people that entails. If you have a fortification set up someplace, you're going to have a small contingent of civilians who come along and set up a town or village nearby, if for no other reason than to supply needed necessities to the garrison and to capitalize on this more or less captive group of soldiers with money and nothing to spend it on. So the Watch of Mordor fails at this point. It is withdrawn. The Tower of Cirith Ungol is abandoned. The Moran is abandoned. Is the various other places that have been maintained and staffed by Gondor is no longer so. This is because they have no choice. in some aspects. Another practice that just, after 1,000 years of watching the desolation and keeping the odd rogue idiot out and keeping what handful of monstrous critters run around inside an inn, they're just tired of it all. So they abandon the Great Watch. This is all part of Sauron's great plan in the long run, though I think we attribute too much to Sauron's so-called machinisms as much as his taking advantage of things when they occur. Did he create the plague? We'll never know. Did he benefit from it? Yeah, all the evidence is there. You can't argue that he doesn't benefit from the plague. So Osgiliath, more or less, is another telling blow. It's not quite complete. It's not the coup de grace just yet, but it's pretty much. The watch over the Mordor is abandoned, and the new king, Telemair, and much of his kin, including his children, die from the plague. The white tree is reported to have died as well, although it says later that it dies at a different point in time. So let's just say the white tree grows sick and is dying, and or it does die. So the Great Plague does more than all the wars and conflict that ever come before in its devastation of Gondor. Gondor suffers at no point in its history, before and after, the sheer amount of death that it does from the plague. So, of course, then the plague continues on into Eredor and does the same. This has a number of important consequences. First off, a lot of these frontier areas to the north of the White Mountains, to the areas that are southeast of Tharbad, for example, areas in Anduin, East Bight, and southeastern Mirkwood, the Long Lake region, these areas up along the Anduin, all could have been thriving human centers of commerce and growth. They're just cut down. They're decimated to the point that many of these places never recover, and further diminishes their ability to do anything other than to barely defend themselves. This causes a mass exodus from the frontier back towards core settlements of humans. So Gondor is going to see some of its lost population replaced by this exodus on the frontier. These people coming back, the soldiers returning from the Morannon and from other places in and around Mordor, settlements to the far south, and settlements to the far north are going to withdraw back into the arms of Gondor and try to recuperate and to restart. So this leaves large portions of Eredor desolate of human inhabitation. Of course, there's still orcs, there's still elves, there's still dwarves, there's still the halflings, but the human promise is rolled back by the Great Plague. This is a two-edged sword for Sauron. If Sauron indeed was the mastermind behind the Great Plague, he takes the long view. It's like his minion, the Witch King. They take the long view. This is something that China is often attributed to, is we don't worry about today as much as we worry about tomorrow. So they plan and work towards the future today. So Sauron loses a lot of his Western allies or minions, these various Easterling and Southron tribes that were constantly putting pressure against Gondor and her territories are also decimated. But what is that to Sauron? He was immortal, right? This is a good thing for him. So when we get 1,000 odd years later, it's such a devastating thing, this plague, that even some 1,000, 1,200 years later, towards the War of the Ring, what do we see? We see ruin. We see small success. Rohan comes back and repopulates a section of northern Gondor and turns it into their own country. And in doing so, they depopulate their former stomping land in the far northern Anduin valleys, which open up opportunities for Sauron's distant forces of orcs and so on and so forth. The western locations around East Blight, the eastern Mirkwood, are never totally recovered. There's still woodmen. There's still enclaves and villages of woodmen on both sides of the forest. Later, the Sauron and the guys of the necromancer plays a role in keeping them down. Long Lake is sacked and destroyed by smog some years, many years in the future. But fact is, a lot of the population up there were diminished. Dorwinen's population is slow to regrow, but they're considered an easterling country and not a westerling country. So their impact, other than trade, does nothing for Gondor. So Gondor is forced to abandon its claim on Umbar. It's weakened to the point where they can't sustain it. The small land areas between Umbar and East Ithilien are eventually abandoned and or conquered by Southron or Eastland tribes. It pushes the borders back. This is the downside of the kin-strife, right? So this brings us to the next great calamity or great setback for Gondor, and it's a setback for the nobility, for the ruling class, for the Gondorian Numerians' psyche, more than it is the actual country as a whole. Around about the Third Age, 1928, Ernor, also known as the Last King, or the 33rd King of Gondor, takes on his role. Ernor was sent north to try to relieve the Witch King's attack on Fornos and on what was on Arthedain, or what was left of Arnor, and he leads the Gondorian contingent north. And by the time they get there, it's too late, too little, too late. They decimate the Witch King's army in the field, destroying it, forcing the Witch King to retire. He abandons Angmar altogether because it served its purpose. Arnor has fallen. There's nobody left except for a handful of these would-be chieftains to keep anything alive. And like I said in previous videos, there's a real role that Aragorn's ancestry played, and their claim, allowing him to have a blood claim on Gondor and have a strong one, remains because a handful of Anárion Dúnedain remain and still manage to hang on and perpetrate at least the Rangers of the North. It gives them some legitimacy in an argument of legitimacy. Well, down south, the line of kings fails utterly. In this case, Ernor, who chafed at the fact that he couldn't battle the Witch King mano a mano at the Battle of Fornos, or in Arnor, or what's left there, former Arnor, is once again challenged by the Witch King to a direct duel, and his psyche, his what have you, would not allow him to deny a second opportunity. He sees himself as a coward if he doesn't do it, and Witch King eggs that on. Which, he was king from my understanding, was from 1928 to 2050. So he's king for a better part of 70 years, and he has no children. There's no indication he ever married, that he ever sired anybody, even bastard children. So this guy is so arrogant, or so into himself, or so gung-ho, a la Alexander the Great, that he couldn't be bothered with making sure that he had an heir. He had plenty of time for that, because he's going to live a couple hundred years. He's not thinking about the future at this point. He's a great warrior, great martial, confident in his own abilities, his martial abilities. So great that he believes he can take on the Witch King. Which, being the king of Gondor, you would think he would have at least some foreknowledge that the Witch King is an immortal being or something else. Because the fact, if this is the same guy that set up Angmar and been around for a better part of 1,000 years and harassing and slowly grinding Arnor down, hello? This is the same fellow. The same bloke comes out of nowhere, supposedly at the head of an army, captures Minas Ithil. There's a thought there. It's not until this period of time, when Gondor takes its first serious hit to its internal borders. Minas Ithil is one of the 3 great cities, or the 5 great cities of Gondor. It is one of the 3 founding cities that were founded. Minas Arnor, Osgiliath, and Minas Ithil were founded by Elendil and his sons when they came to Gondor. Keeping in mind, Paligar existed as a city a long time before that, and it's a very big city. It's not some little fly spot on a map. Not in reality. It's a pretty potent city. But minus the throne. For the first time in Gondor's history since the formation of it as a kingdom, loses a key city. Now, Osgiliath is decimated. It's fought over. It's destroyed and dropped into ruins. First by its own people. The kin-strife devastates the capital city of Gondor. Makes it very, probably half or more than half its population no longer live in there. Lots of ruin and destruction. Followed by the plague. The plague decimates Osgiliath, kills off a big portion of the population that didn't leave. But yet it's still considered a city. It's still populated. It's not up until toward the end or the beginning of the War of the Ring is Osgiliath completely destroyed and abandoned and becomes nothing but a contested spot. But that's the key thing there. It's contested. At no point does the forces of Sauron or any of his proxies lay claim to and control of what was the capital of Gondor. Now, Minas Ithil, on the other hand, Minas Ithil is captured and held and never reoccupied, never repopulated, never recaptured by Gondor, ever. We know in the Fourth Age, during the middle of or toward the concluding time of the War of the Ring, Aragorn and the army of the West marches up to the entry to the Morgul Vale, sets it on fire, and Aragorn bans anybody from going in there, and later has the city razed. So the Tower of Minas Ithil and the city's razed, and that's that. They're so corrupt, they're so irredeemable in the eyes of the Gondorians, especially what's left of the ruling, the Númenórean elite. It's got to go. So when we look at the plague and we look at the aspects of the kin-strife from the Gondorian Númenórean perspective, we have a the largest population of Númenórean-blooded men, high men, living in and around Gondor. Then they fight each other, and they do what their opponents couldn't do for 1,200 years or 1,500 years. They decimate themselves. And they decimate themselves in conflict and disillusion. So when a big portion of them flee or migrate out to Umbar and other places, this is a gut blow to the Highman portion of Gondor, the elite of Gondor, what makes this the Númenórean bastion that it was. And then some less than 100 years later, we're hit by the plague, and the plague devastates the population. As much as 25% they are suggesting is dying from this, which would include the Númenórean descendants. The Númenórean bloodlines take another hit. So if we've got a few thousand left, now we've lost a quarter of that. So now we've lost, if we say 2,000 left, we just lost 500 people that are of Númenórean descent, of actual high men, and countless lesser divinity. Yet there's still sufficient numbers to make Gondor viable and still powerful and capable. So comes the time of Ernor and his foolish quest to fight the Witch King one-on-one. He defies all of his advisors, all of their threats and implications, imploring him not to do this. He does it anyway. He rides off to Minas Ithil, enters the city, and is never seen from again. It's assumed he's killed. Gondor assumes the same. Now, this means the end of the bloodline for Gondor's Númenóreans. There are nobody with sufficient ties to the throne left. And we see the decimation of the kin-strife, killing a big portion of the cousins and nephews and uncles and aunts and so on and so forth of Anárian's line, who were the kings of Gondor. And we whittled it down to this one fellow. Anybody left is an insufficient amount of Anárian's bloodline in them and in their family to have a legal claim on the throne. Nobody can replace Aragorn. Or Arnor. So when Arnor goes off on this adventure, this mad adventure of his, and never comes home, we see another gut blow to the population, to Gondor as a political entity or as a cultural entity. Now, this doesn't mean that Ernor's death is the death of what's left of the Gondorian Dunedain population, the Númenórean bloodlines. That's not true. There's still plenty of them. The ruling steward line is thick with it. There's plenty of other family line groups that exist. Just none of them have a legitimate binding claim for the throne. Nothing that would be accepted by anybody else. It's an interesting thought that we could have seen a second civil war at this point, as somebody, some powerful family decided to say, I have enough claim, even if it's a tenth of a percent, that I should, my son or I should be sitting on the throne of Gondor. We don't see this. And the power of the family of the stewards are sufficiently strong enough to mitigate or to discourage that sort of mindset from occurring as well. So we got this lost opportunity or a missed chance of further decimation of their bloodlines. They're just still reeling from the concept of the plague when some years later the last king takes off. Now, we can make the argument that it's been 100 and some years. This is true. But we must keep in mind that one of the reasons that the Númenórean Gondorian Dunedain are considered highmen is because of their bloodlines being direct descendants of Númenor. Means their lifespans are still much greater than that of their fellow lesser men, the rest of Gondor. So it's not outrageous to think that some of these families who grew up when the kin-strife was happening, maybe even fought as young men and young women, or were involved in the kin-strife, survived the plague and lived long enough to see their king and his bloodline die. These same people. And how much mindset, I've mentioned that several times in previous videos, how much different does your mindset going to be if you know you've got 300 years of potential life ahead of you? You know, we, as human beings, have this drive in our youth to accomplish and to move forward at breakneck speed, sometimes foolishly fast by the eyes of our elders. Because genetically, we can't envision the idea the end of our life is coming. It's not until we get to middle age that we start having those forethoughts. So we slow down and we seem to, our priorities change. We realize that half our life is gone, or more than half our life is gone. We are now on a descending count. But if you could sit there and say that, and yet you live to be 200 years old or 150 years old, and live through several great catastrophes to your homeland, what kind of effect is that going to have? I mean, it's just one of those things that comes out of this that I asked that question, and I don't think I've ever heard anybody else having mentioned it in any of your videos, but it's something I wanted to thought about, right? So we get to asking, full of his martial abilities and his belief in his own infallibility, Erner takes up the challenge of the Witch King to single combat, despite all advice and common sense. Come on, common sense says you don't ride into the clutches of something like the Witch King, who oversaw the destruction of Arnor, and takes the only time a major Gondorian city falls to the enemy and is held, until its destruction is led by this guy, whatever he is. You're just going to blindly ride off into the middle of his term, in his place? If you're going to fight him in a one-on-one combat, you should have done it out there in an open field somewhere near Osgiliath or somewhere in Ithilien, but not in Minas Ithil. That's just suicide. Where's the common sense there? Obviously, it's not there. And we do, as a collectively and individually, as human beings, do some pretty stupid things when we don't listen to the common sense in our heads. We don't see the world as we should see it, as more than just you and your neighbor, or you and your family. We are part of a bigger thing, and when we tend to forget this, other people take advantage of that, much to our chagrin and later, possibly, our lives. So the king rides off to Minas Morgul, never seen again. So he also failed to leave an heir. The implications here, right, are pretty vast and pretty strong. The fact is, there is no direct bloodline left of Anárian's blood. But yet there is. Yes, there is. And I'll mention part of that in my last section on the Gondor successor in part 3, because I believe it's worth noting. But there's a king of Gondor before the end of Arthedain, before Arnor fell, attempts to rally and strengthen the ties between the two kingdoms, and marries the daughter of the king of Isildur, Isildur's bloodline. When Aragorn's ancestors, his great mother, great aunt, however you want to look at it, probably great aunt, marries one of the kings of Gondor and rebinds that bloodline together and strengthens it. This, in part, plays an important role down the road because Aragorn now has several avenues of claim when he does come to the south. When he does come for the crown of Gondor, it's as both the son of Eladil, the son of Isildur, but also son of Anárion. That's another thing that doesn't crop off much. I don't hear a lot of talk about it, but you think about that for a minute. No, and no other bloodline, no other person, or descendants of people in the Númenórean blood of the faithful is the strongest ties to kingship of all. Both would be, both Gondor and Arnor, and overall both as the High King is Aragorn, because his descendant bloodline is from Isildur, and Isildur is the son of Eladil, who is the High King, or was the only High King. Isildur does marry Frieza. He's one of two High Kings to exist, because Isildur becomes the High King of Arnor and Gondor. They don't have a direct name for both combined countries because they're not a combined country, but he has claim over both. It's through his bloodline and descendants of his bloodline that Aragorn has his claim to the throne of Arnor and to the throne of Gondor. This is doubled down, a millennia plus later, several millennia later, when a sitting king of Anárian's blood marries a princess of Isildur's blood, giving Aragorn a indirect claim from the Anárian bloodline. Now, he's not of the Anárian blood, but he is affiliated with it. He is a cousin or a whatever you want to look at. So he still has that legitimate claim. But I guess it's just not strong enough or important enough to be being mentioned. So this is a crucial moment and section of Gondor's history. This kin-strife, followed by the Great Plague, and then the death of the only living king, the last of his blood, in Gondor, should have shut Gondor down on several occasions. Gondor's grossly diminished. So even takes almost 1,000 odd years later, when we see the War of the Ring, it's still a shadow of its former self. But how grand must that shadow have been at its height for it to survive and thrive even in the time of the War of the Ring, and to leave something for Aragorn, King Isildur, to build upon. Till next time, this is Rick. Have a great weekend.